let's start with Israel. So on Monday afternoon, Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden had their first phone call since February 15th. We can put this element up here. And over the last 2 days, we've been hearing kind of the fallout from this call. And so what both Biden and Netanyahu have been leaking out to the public and sometimes saying just straight up publicly is that Biden told Netanyahu, do not launch an invasion of Rafah, which has now well more than 1 million people who are taking refuge there. They were pushed out of Gaza City and told to go down to Khan Yunis. They were then pushed out of Khan Yunis and told to go down to Rafah, which these safe corridors were created where people were sniped and killed along the way. They continue to bomb Rafah. They continue to kind of launch little incursions here and there, but Israel still is holding out the specter of a full-scale invasion into Rafah. And Emily, the case that Israel is making is that there are still about two Hamas battalions that are holed up in Rafah, as well as roughly 100 remaining hostages who have yet to be released. And Netanyahu's argument that he made to the Knesset yesterday is that you cannot defeat Hamas without dismantling these final 2 battalions. The Biden administration has said, and Jake Sullivan gave a press conference on Monday making this point, he says you can defeat Hamas without going into Rafah, and that the idea that even if you dismantle these remaining 2 battalions, that means you have ended Hamas is also a fantasy. Like Hamas has already reconstituted in northern Gaza because there is no political solution that has been put forward by the parties here. Right. And so just eliminating a couple battalions does not eliminate Hamas. So I think that what's clearly going on here is something different, which is like why would they be going after Rafah, which is the city closest to the Egyptian border. If going after Hamas battalions in the past has not actually ended the control of the region by Hamas. But what has it done in northern Gaza, in central Gaza? Made it completely uninhabitable. So this to me feels like another move by Israel toward making Gaza completely uninhabitable.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting read that we'll get to in a second. We have a clip of Jared Kushner actually kind of getting into that point. But one thing in the NBC News article that was just on the screen, it's interesting. Netanyahu told lawmakers, quote, he had an argument, or we had an argument is how he phrased it, with the Americans. And that, again, Ryan, we've seen some leaks. And I'm curious for your perspective on how you read this, because I know a lot of people on the left have read this as the Biden administration is leaking to places like NBC News to show that they are putting room between them and Netanyahu, that there's all of this space between them and Netanyahu. In this case, it actually seems to be legitimate, that there actually is some huge daylight between the Biden administration's position, which is obviously much more reasonable. The difference between defeating Hamas and not defeating Hamas is certainly not 2 battalions in Rafah. And substantively, where Netanyahu is, that actually seems like in this case, it is absolutely real and not just the sort of window dressing that they're leaking to the press for the case of perception.
And rhetorically, it's different. But if the United States is still arming Israel and is refusing to put into place any restrictions on weapons, then is it just cover for the United States? And actually, Lloyd Austin was asked about this specific thing this week at a press conference, saying, you have encouraged Israel many times to let in more humanitarian aid and to reduce civilian casualties. They haven't done so. Why not leverage weapons sales, weapons transfers? And Lloyd Austin just simply said, no, we're not going to do that. Like, Israel has a right to defend itself, and Hamas can lay down its arms at any moment. Like, so the second that there's any pressure applied to the U.S. position, it completely caves. And so you wind up with mere rhetoric. So Netanyahu, I think, can feel confident coming out of that call with the Biden administration, with Biden himself, saying, you know what, we can move forward on this. Vedant Patel, State Department spokesperson, on Monday said Israel cannot go into Rafah. And the AP reporter there, Matt Lee, said, you just said cannot. What do you mean cannot? And he's like, well, it would be very difficult for them just logistically. And Matt Lee says, well, aren't they a sovereign country? And he kind of sort of backed off the use of the word can, because of course they can. But it is an interesting point that Vedant was sort of hinting at, which is, can they? Like, do they have the capacity? What is not talked about much in the U.S. here is that Israel's not doing well in the ground war. Like, they have effectively been able to turn most of Gaza into rubble. But when they have engaged with Hamas in street battles, they have often lost. We see almost daily videos of Israeli tanks getting blown up, of Israeli soldiers going down, getting evacuated. And so the question is, that's happening in these rubble-strewn areas. How do they physically do that in a densely populated area? A city that was like 300,000 people on October 6th is now like almost 1.5 million. Like, how do you even accomplish a street battle there?
To that point, 130 hostages. Some 130 hostages remain, and that's been Israel's priority for months. And to have that many hostages remaining is obviously not a sign of a successful military operation. It is a sign of Hamas's continued barbarity, but of a successful military operation, it is not a sign. So they have, and to your point, Hamas has already reconstituted in northern Gaza. Let's put A2 up on the screen, because this investigation from Al Jazeera and the Washington Post, this is from the Washington Post, they did an investigation about what happened to two members of an Al Jazeera crew, and Al Jazeera has presented some more evidence about this as well. Drone footage, this is the headline, raises questions about Israeli justification for deadly strike on Gaza journalists. This was in Khan Yunis. Two members of Al Jazeera's crew, a 27-year-old and a 30-year-old, were killed on January 7th, along with their driver. Then two freelance journalists were seriously wounded. They were returning from the scene of an earlier Israeli strike on a building where they had used a drone to capture the aftermath. The Washington Post actually on their website has footage of them operating the drone footage that they were taking. It's a drone that was being used. It's like available at Best Buy. It's basically a commercially available, normal drone that civilians would use. IDF said in a statement the next day that it had, quote, identified and struck a terrorist who operated an aircraft that posed a threat to IDF troops. 2 days later, the IDF said that it had been in response to, quote, an immediate threat in the area because both men belonged to militant groups. This was the claim from the IDF. It doesn't appear that was the case. There's some evidence that Israel is pointing to. I think it's like a name in a log,
right?
That Israel is pointing to that one of them was affiliated with Hamas in some way. But it's pretty unconvincing evidence. I'm curious what you thought of this.
It's this weird, I think gaslighting is overused in our current contemporary lexicon, but it really does apply to the coverage of this war. So the Washington Post writes here, and good for the Washington Post for conducting this investigation. This is not shade on them, but they write that no Israeli soldiers, aircraft, or other military equipment are visible in the footage taken that day, which the Post is publishing in its entirety, raising critical questions about why the journalists were targeted. Fellow reporters said they were unaware of troop movements in the area. So what they're saying is there was no reason that they can identify, either from witnesses or from drone footage, but there was a security concern going on here. Yet these journalists were struck anyway, and it says it kind of raises questions about why the journalists were targeted. In the days after they were targeted, Israel said publicly they targeted them on purpose because of these claimed links. And so that's where the gaslighting comes in. It's like, raises questions about why they were targeting. Israel's like, no, we hit the journalists on purpose. This is the Al Jazeera Gaza bureau chief's son who was killed in this in strike. And they're saying, look, he's a terrorist. Like there's two freelance journalists that were killed here too. They're all terrorists, and we hit them on purpose. And so to then use investigative resources to go back and say, doesn't seem to be any reason why they were struck. Implying that perhaps maybe they were struck on purpose when Israel has already said they were struck on purpose is kind of crazy making, I think, for an audience who's like, wait a minute, they already admitted why they did this.
Yeah, they
And
said
they continued to do it day after day after day after day.
Right. The first statement said that the aircraft posed a threat to Israeli troops. And again,
Right.
you can watch the video. It's clearly a drone that you would pick up at Best Buy being operated
Right.
by a
And it would be fair to
non-combatant.
debunk that claim from the IDF, but the IDF's claims always evolve, within, there's the claim in the immediate aftermath of the attack, then there's the claim 6 hours later, then there's the claim the next day, and so they eventually moved away from this, the drone was a threat, to, well, we hit them in a car,
Right.
because they are terrorists, and it took them like a week to come up with this claim that they were terrorists, although their allies online were circulating it kind of immediately.
Interviews with 14 witnesses, the Post says, to the attack and colleagues of the slain reporters offer the most detailed account yet of the deadly incident. The Post found no indications that either man was operating as anything other than a journalist that day. Both passed through Israeli checkpoints on their way to the south early in the war. One of them had been approved to leave Gaza, which is rare. You wouldn't give that to someone, as the Post points out, who is a, quote, known militant. The Post asked the IDF a lot of questions about it, and they just replied, quote, "We have nothing further to add."
Right, and also, setting aside this particular case, in general, Hamas has been the government of Hamas has been the government since 2006 in Gaza. Like, a lot of people are going to have affiliations with the government.
Yes. Yeah.
Barak Ravid, who's done really impressive reporting, like tons of scoops for Axios. We'll talk about one of his scoops later, was in the reserves in Israel. If Hamas assassinated him, that would not be justified by the fact that he had previously served in the reserves. It's an insane way to think about people, and it's only, I think, made possible by dehumanization. Like, if you don't think about people as the complicated kind of citizens and kind of active members of a community that they are. Israel recently killed, they called it a top Hamas commander, but he was the guy whose job it was to work with the UN and the aid agencies to make sure that there was security around the aid trucks getting into northern Gaza. Israel had previously said that they would not attack the policemen who are trying to keep security in these areas. Those policemen are all, quote unquote, Hamas. Because if Hamas is the government, then anybody working for them is Hamas. And so they killed this guy, found him in a hospital and killed him. And then they announced publicly, we just, took out a top Hamas commander.
Mm-hmm. And again, Israel is claiming that they put out a statement and linked to a document, the Post notes. It was dated to June of 2022. It had the military wing of the PIJ, and one of the journalists' names was next to a line item for $224. They mentioned a second document that named the other journalist as a squad deputy commander of the Hamas Gaza City Brigade, but did not make that document public and did not respond to numerous requests to review it. And the Post was unable to confirm any other evidence that they were acting as anything other than journalists when they were killed. Again, the quote from the IDF was that they were flying an aircraft that posed a threat. It was a civilian drone that you could pick up at Best Buy, and they had gone through Israeli security checkpoints. So, Brian, it's just...
Right, and they deconflict all the time with... the IDF knows where these journalists are, because it's extremely dangerous to go anywhere without the IDF knowing where you are. So that's another thing that has raised so many alarms about so many of these killings of journalists, that they get cleared ahead of time to go to an area and then get killed.
It's frustrating it's frustrating, period. But one of the reasons that it's frustrating, from my perspective, the fog of war is a real thing. And obviously, there are going to be, in any war, it's one of the reasons why we should all just generally oppose war. There are going to be civilian casualties, and it is awful. But the consistent situations that come up, whether it's, you could go all the way back to Shireen Akleh, you can find many examples of this. It just is the pattern of shifting stories in these cases is frustrating, because it goes beyond, I think, the fog of war often, and becomes a ham-fisted propaganda strategy that is utterly unconvincing. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.